A couple things before we start today's video. Number one, I do not want to my own life. I don't want to. I have no desire to, and that's not going to happen anytime in the near future. Number two, all facts presented in today's episode can be independently verified by visiting the resources document at the bottom of this description. We care about facts here on this show. That's what we're big on. And number three, all parties are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And now, welcome to the Conspiracy Files. So on today's episode, we are going to be discussing, once again, a ring. Now, you guys may be wondering why I choose to do these shows and talk so much about this stuff. It's because A, nobody knows that this stuff happens to the degree that it does, and these people have been able to get away with these cover-ups for decades, hundreds of years even. And I'm an advocate for victims and for children, and it's just something that I felt drawn to do. I also got sober last year and realized after doing some of these investigations, I don't know if you guys have seen the full-length documentaries that I produce on my channel, the Paranormal Files. There's something within me that calls me to discuss these things and bring these things to people's attention. I don't know why that is. To me, I take that as something from God, from above. You can believe in whatever you want to believe, but I've had some really weird spiritual experiences surrounding this stuff, so there's just so much to talk about here, and this is a whole nother case of deep corruption, strange deaths, victims that were unheard for decades. And this was a story I just happened to come across when I was researching one night and decided to do a whole show on it because it was pretty mind-blowing. This is something I had never heard of until about 2 months ago when I decided to add this to the list of shows I wanted to do. Today's research and writing is brought to you in part by Sabrin Chandler Lewis. She has done an amazing job. Everybody give some love to Sabrin in the comments and the chat. But without further ado, let's just get going. As a child, we're told to trust the people who take care of us. We're told to do as they say, and we believe that they would never harm us. Our minds are still innocent, and for the fortunate ones, they will remain that way until we reach an age where we begin to understand more of the damning aspects of our world. As children, we believe that people are good by nature, that they want to help us, and that we want to help them. Through the eyes of a child, the world is good, vibrant, and an incredible place. A place where those we love take care of us, and we love them in return. Most people can never bring it upon themselves to harm a child. We see their trusting and innocent nature as sacred. We see them as the young ones who must be protected at all costs, who we would give our lives for in place of theirs. But for those children who are unfortunate, for those children who their caretakers betray, that innocence is not so hallowed. For these children, life is a nightmare of never-ending obstacles, fear, and mistrust. This is the horrifying truth for the little ones who lived in the LAMBETH Children's Homes from the 1960s to the 1990s. These children endured horrible sexual assault as well as racism at the hands of those they were meant to trust. London, I was just there earlier this month. We did a whole documentary on the Elms Guest House. That's an episode that's coming on here soon. We also did a full-length documentary on Marc Dutroux and the chateaus and the elite society of child that operated in Belgium and probably still does. So those are two big documentaries that are coming soon. But I was just in London and I love London. There's so much history, so many great people there. And London is thought of as an idealistic place for many. A place where the streets are vibrant and lively, somewhere that you'd want to visit on a vacation like I just did. Yet, within those streets lies the darkest of shadows, which conceal the most disturbing of secrets. Secrets that remain sealed because people, apparently, allegedly, were murdered. The Lambeth child abuse ring, a harrowing reality hiding behind the beautiful streets of London, has recently come to light, revealing the depths of depravity that some will go to, destroying the innocence and even lives of the most vulnerable among us. This is the story of the Lambeth Children's Homes. London, a city that's been around for over 1,000 years, formed the borough of Lambeth in 1965. Lambeth covers around 7 miles running from north to south and 3 miles from east to west, with its most populated areas being Kennington, Vauxhall, Clapham, Stockwell, and Norwood. Lambeth lies close to central London, with the iconic River Thames lying at its northern border. Its population fluctuated over the years, at one point falling into the 200,000s, and then rising back up to its current population, nearly 1/3 And like most boroughs, Lambeth had its own council with their own rules. One of those rules was in regard to social services and the care of children. The Lambeth Council created the role of Director of Social Services in 1971, which replaced the previous role of Children's Officer. There weren't only roles dedicated to their care, there were government-sponsored children's facilities as well. In the years between 1960 and 1994, the London Borough of Lambeth had opened 33 children's homes. That's a lot of children's homes. These homes were places where parentless children and kids with disabilities, as well as children with behavioral issues, could go and receive care until they were able to be returned to their parents or were able to live independently. One of these homes was Shirley Oaks, a sprawling mass of land that could accommodate around 350 children at any time. Shirley Oaks was opened in 1905 and was organized differently than most children's homes of the day. It was organized in such a way that children would live on the sprawling grounds in cottages, rather than in a large facility as most did. It covered 80 acres and had at least 38 cottages. Shirley Oaks had its own school, medical and leisure facilities. It was meant to be a paradise with its green fields and streams, a beautiful place for a child to grow up. But for the children who lived in the Lambeth Children's Homes, it was far from a joyful place to live. And now we get to the victims. The approach of cottage-style living was considered out of date by 1965 when the Lambeth Council was created. In that year, they became responsible for Shirley Oaks. But even when the council took over, Shirley Oaks was not held in high regard. Just a year before, in 1964, the regional inspector wrote, "The house mothers in these crowded cottages rarely achieve a high standard of care." But this is only the beginning. Not only did the children suffer from neglect, but they also suffered the worst kinds of harm a person can inflict on a child: physical, and racial abuse. Husna Banu Talukdar, an Iranian woman, was only around 12 years of age when she entered Shirley Oaks. There, she suffered unspeakable crimes at the hands of her caregivers. She had only been at Shirley Oaks for a few weeks when she woke to see the child in the bed next to her being assaulted. The child, Dorothy Winter, had a pillow held over her face as a member of staff committed the monstrous act of rape. Husna Banu and Dorothy became friends as they lived at Shirley Oaks. But sadly, it wasn't long before Husna too began to suffer the fate so many other children did. She also faced racial discrimination, being called hateful language associated with her ethnic group. She was subjected to pure hatred by her caregivers, with staff telling her things like, "Don't worry, we'll get you scrubbed up white." Many other children faced the horrors of Shirley Oaks, such as James Kenny, who was in Lambeth Children's Homes from roughly 1986 to 1998. His childhood was so filled with physical and abuse that he came to believe it was a normal part of life. He believed that he was responsible for what happened to him, saying that he must have upset his abusers, and that if he had stayed out of their way, he wouldn't have been harmed. He didn't realize that the abuses were far from normal until he grew older. He lived his everyday by the phrase, "watch your back," and in a BBC interview, he stated that at night, whenever he heard his door open, he would feel chills run down his spine. Later in the interview, he breaks down in tears remembering his experience at the children's home.
You could never relax. I mean, I'd be laying in my room and you'd hear your door open and it'd run chills down your back. It all came back to me about the abuse, seeing people's faces. I was waking up terrorized in my sleep. I didn't want to cry.
His life was nothing less than hell, all at the hands of sick and twisted people who promised to protect him. Shirley Oaks had over 2,400 resident children between 1965 and 1983, and a staggering number of these residents reported their abuses. You see, by June of 2020, at least 529 people had come forward to the Lambeth Council and stated that they were sexually abused while living in the facility. Almost 530 children abused there. I mean, that is just an insane number. Their abusers? Well, they were the over 120 adults who were employed by Shirley Oaks or other children's facilities. Over 120 adults were connected to this abuse, yet there were no successful prosecutions at all until the year 2001, years after they closed. It seemed that the Lambeth Children's Homes were covering up the abuse. You see, 705 former residents had come forward about their ordeals at 3 different Lambeth Children's Homes. But in 4 decades, only 1 staff member was disciplined. 705 victims come forward, and you discipline 1 staff member. That is unbelievably f***ed. More children's homes were noted as guilty than just Shirley Oaks, such as the facilities of Angel Road and South Vale. but Shirley Oaks is by far the most notorious. Husna Banu, even as an adult, is still overwhelmed by her past and the dark memories associated with the children's home. The flashbacks she suffers plague her every moment, and she sadly attempted to take her own life a few years ago. She recalls going into a coma, and when the hospital staff attempted to wake her, she cried out for her attackers to stop and for them to not harm her. Shirley Oaks closed in 1983, but Husna remembers those dark years as if they were yesterday. Husna Banu survived her attempt to take her own life. However, others didn't. Others such as Dorothy Winter, the little girl whom Husna had shared a room with at the children's home. She took her own life years after the abuse ended. And like we said before, Husna is not the only victim, and at least 705 people have come forward to state that they were victims of abuse at the Lambeth Children's Homes. One girl recounts a horrifying experience that she was not only raped and abused at the homes, but that she was taken out by workers and sold into prostitution for years. And like we said, approximately 700 of those victims reported their abuse, but that's most certainly an underestimate of how big the number of abuse victims really is. You see, most victims of abuse don't come forward for many years, if they even come forward at all. And with the number of children at these homes over the 4 decades of reported abuse, that number could measure truly into the thousands. But it wasn't only the staff members that abused the children of Lambeth. It's reported that members of staff let members of the public come into the premises and take children with them. It's also reported that staff members would allow public people, anybody off the street, to come into the children's home to rape kids there on the children's home grounds. And some of these reported rapists who entered these homes, according to victims, were high status individuals, members of the upper class, people that were prominent, and people that were well known. The extent of the abuse is absolutely horrific. Children regularly reported hearing screams throughout the night as other children were assaulted, and some victims reported being photographed as the attacks took place. Yes, these sick were raping these children with practical immunity, and they were photographing and videoing themselves as they raped these children. And like we see in these cases all the time, it would not surprise me if they had been selling these child pornography images and videos all across the world into these rings. And these children were abused by nearly everyone in some cases, from their foster parents to their football instructors to their swimming coaches and even their doctors as well. These places were infested with pedophiles. Everybody was a pedophile that was in on this. The foster parents were pimping out the kids. The doctors were raping children in their offices. I mean, truly horrific stuff. But who could do such a thing? And how was this all allowed to go on for decades? The reports of abuse span from 1960 all the way to the 1990s. And over the ensuing investigation, over 100 different pedophiles were later identified. And now we get to the criminals of Lambeth. There are many alleged abusers in the case of the Lambeth Children's Homes, with at least 2 of them being volunteer police officers. But most of these perpetrators went unnamed, especially in a later inquiry report. But there are still cases open that are being investigated right now. As it stands, only a select small group of these have ever been charged in the first place. You've got over 100 identified, but only a few have been charged with a crime. This gross miscarriage of justice was allowed to happen through fraud, corruption, racism, and nepotism by the staff and counselors of Lambeth. Those who wanted to report the abuse were intimidated into keeping quiet or forced into silence through murder. Out of the 6 of those that were confirmed to be charged, the most notable are Donald Hosegood, Leslie Paul, and Michael John Carroll. Donald Hosegood was one of the earliest reported abusers, with his case marking the beginning of major child abuse reports at the homes. Donald worked as a house parent with his wife at Shirley Oaks starting in 1968, and in 1975, he was tried for 11 charges of rape and assault. According to the victims, there were at least 4 children that Donald had raped. And yet, though his crimes were diabolical, Donald's trial only lasted 4 days. He had been asked only to leave their family cottage for 2 weeks pending developments, and a sickening letter had been provided by Lambeth Council on Donald's behalf. This letter was sent by the senior children's homes officer, Mr. N. Elliott, to Lambeth Council's chief solicitor, or prosecutor. It described the belief that the allegations were pure fantasy, that the children's history was given to fantasy, and that the previous relationship between Donald and the children he cared for suggested personal victimization against him. the management of the Lambeth Children's Homes, the home that he was associated with, wrote in essentially to the prosecutors after he was accused of raping 4 children and said, oh, those kids were just making that up. There's reason to believe these kids would want to take him down, and we don't believe the victims. Donald's victims then received no support from the Lambeth Council through the justice process, which only made matters worse. But the most horrific part of Donald's allegations came 2 years after the trial. One of his victims, named LAA2 by an inquiry report, was found dead in a Shirley Oaks bathroom. So, Donald's victim, who came out and spoke against him just 2 years after the trial, was found dead in that same children's home. Now, LAA2, the victim's sister, stated that he had received proper support throughout the trial and that if Donald was still imprisoned, her brother might still be alive. The end of Donald's trial was treated as the end of this entire matter, and there was no disciplinary investigation at all. Even though Donald was reinvestigated again in 1998, it was again a failure of justice, where they swept Donald and his rapes and his crimes completely under the rug. Now, Donald died in 2011, never the subject of further police investigation, meaning Donald got away with violently 4 children, probably more children, and possibly allegedly murdering a child to keep them silent. Completely died facing no repercussions at all. No prison time, no fees to pay, nothing. I hope he's enjoying the view looking up at us right now. Leslie Paul, the second infamous criminal, was implicated in child abuse at the South Vale Assessment Center in West Norwood. He was accused of grooming children with gifts and then molesting them. Leslie had something that his victims called the bad room, where he would lock the children away and assault them while acting like he was performing medical examinations. So he would lock these kids in a room, act like a doctor, and rape these children while he was doing fake medical procedures on them. Leslie Paul, the same guy, was also later implicated in producing child porn, as a girl who visited Leslie's home stated that she saw photos of topless children pasted all over his walls. She stated that when she tried to report him back in the 1990s, she was threatened by the Lambeth Council with legal action. So you can see here the Lambeth Council not only doesn't want to hear about this shit, but they want the victims to stay quiet. They are not going to get exposed for hiring hundreds of Leslie, the same went on to commit further atrocities relating to his abuse of children, and when he would later finally be charged for his crimes, he called all of his victims liars. Now, Leslie was jailed for offenses against children in 1994, but he was released in 2002, 8 years later, as the sentencing judge believed he had achieved rehabilitation. But in 2015, Leslie was found guilty of 15 indecent assaults, 1 count of indecency with a child, 1 count of aiding and abetting indecent assault on a boy under 14, and 1 count of making an indecent image of a child. He was jailed for 13 years in response to his crimes. So Leslie at least got some jail time. Not enough. If it was me, I would give these people life in prison, even more harsher punishment if, we could get to that, but at least life, not this measly 20 years that these people get. Think of all the lives they ruin, the multiple children they lock up in rooms, they physically abuse, they harm, they rape, and they get just like a measly prison sentence. But the third on this list, who is by far the most notorious, is a man named Michael John Carroll. Michael was in charge of the Angel Road Children's Home from 1981 to 1990. And Michael himself had been charged with the sexual abuse of a child in 1966, 15 years before he started his position as the manager of a children's home. But because of certain statutes in British law, the Lambeth Council was not aware of his conviction when he applied to be a house manager. And of course, Michael had refused to disclose it to them. However, they eventually learned of his conviction through a fostering application check made by a neighboring borough. A disciplinary hearing was conducted while he was the house manager, and at the end of it, it was decided that Michael neglecting to disclose his prior conviction was not grounds for misconduct. Michael, even after being proven as a offender who had been accused of raping children, was then allowed to go back to running the Angel Road Children's Home. Now, Michael would go on to be accused of soliciting children to adults, running parties where children were offered to members of the public. And once again, some of these people that allegedly came to these parties were high-ranking public officials, people that would be recognized out on the street. It's always a common theme that we see in these stories. People get access to kids, They abuse the access that they have, and then they start, for some reason, offering children up on a silver platter to at these high-ranking parties. It's crazy to me. It's like throwing out chum into sharky water. You can't see the sharks, but the moment you put the chum out, those sharks are gonna emerge from the darkness. And you just gotta imagine there's like a million sharks in the water. That's how many are out there waiting for these opportunities. But back to Michael. Michael was also frequently accused of assaulting children himself and would eventually receive a 10-year sentence for doing just that. But of that 10-year sentence, he only served 5. And now we get to Operation Middleton, Chile, and Operation Trawler. So, how did this abuse go on for so long? How did hundreds, almost probably thousands of children, how were these thousands of kids allowed to be raped by staff members for decades? Reports were being made. There were hundreds of reports made, yet no one looked into it deeply at all. In the late 1990s, operations were conducted to look into the allegations of child abuse, which had been made frequently in the past. What resulted was nothing more than an effort to hide the extent of that child abuse. You see, in 1993, Michael John Carroll's abuse of children was revealed. An investigation by Merseyside Police and Operation Care finally showed the world what a monster this man was. It began in 1993, focusing on the abuse that Michael inflicted on children at St. Edmund's Children's Home in Liverpool, where he had worked before coming to Angel Road. By the year 1998, they were investigating allegations related to his employment by Lambeth Council. Now, Michael would eventually plead guilty to 35 charges of indecent assault and buggery of young boys in the 1970s and 80s. Buggery, in US terms, is intercourse, obviously non-consensual. And one of the key players in this investigation into Michael was a man named Clive Driscoll, a detective inspector on the Lambeth Child Protection Team. He advised that the Merseyside Police, who had begun the investigation into St. Edmunds, needed the aid of the Metropolitan Police, and that assistance became known as Operation Trawler. In this operation, victims of abusers were invited to come forward, and what resulted was additional allegations against other staff at facilities such as Angel Road and South Vale. Driscoll, that investigator, after learning that Michael liked to make high-profile friends, began to speak with individuals connected to the Lambeth Council Children's Homes, such as Miss Anna Tapsell and Miss Teresa Johnson, a former counselor and former Angel Road manager, respectively. Miss Johnson believed that Michael was hosting parties in an apartment on the premises of Angel Road, inviting people who were not connected at all to the children's home into this apartment so that they could pay to rape children. Now, Driscoll, the investigator, also learned that Michael Carroll had petitioned to become a foster parent in the past, and that this process was marked by confusion and disagreement. You see, the Lambeth Council itself was extremely supportive of Carroll's petition, but Carroll needed the support of the neighboring borough of Southwark also. But Southwark refused to grant him this support, finding him unsuitable, obviously, as he had that prior conviction of child abuse in the 1960s. But that seemed to be fine with the Lambeth Council, as he had retained his positions in their childcare facility, and a fight between the two councils ensued. That's right, the Lambeth Council actually went out of their way to fight, saying that Michael, this man who has been accused by children of them, a man who has in the past been convicted of a child, that he should be able to become a foster parent. What the fuck is that? The official who blocked a petition in Southwark would eventually receive a call from a man named Paul Bodang, who asked if there was anything he could do to resolve this disagreement between the two councils, but the official refused his help. Now, investigator Driscoll confirmed allegations that Miss Johnson had made about Michael's parties, with a list of 10 children he found who had all made complaints during that time that Michael was in charge of Angel Road. These kids all testified that Michael was conducting these parties on campus. It also came to light that Michael Carroll would attend children's camps, and dignified visitors, members of the elite, the governing class, would often show up to these camps unannounced. Now, Clive Driscoll, the investigator, eventually wanted to talk to this Paul Bodang, the man who had made the call to the Southwark official. Paul had also been connected to Michael's parties, as well as Michael's camp visits. Paul had also recently been appointed to the position of Minister of Police, essentially the police chief. Yet suddenly, when this line of inquiry was opened and investigator Driscoll began to tell others of his suspicions, Driscoll found himself removed from the case.
This is the one period in my career which just troubles me greatly.
Driscoll was accused of stirring up a hornet's nest, but he was also accused of serious indiscretions. He was informed that political sensitivities resulted in his removal from the Lambeth Child Protection Team. In short terms, layman's terms, he was looking at exposing the crimes of a minister, and he suffered for it. Nigel Goldie, another Lambeth official, knew that Driscoll was about to approach Paul. Goldie believed that Driscoll told too many people about his intent to speak to Paul, and Goldie informed the Lambeth Council of his concerns. Within days of this meeting, Goldie was approached by Officer Richard Gargini. Gargini reportedly told Goldie to, quote, forget about Driscoll and his leads, end quote. He was also told nothing more would be done and that the matter was closed. He was especially told to keep the matter to himself. Driscoll's career suffered because of this action, and after he was removed, he was told his case had no substance. He had found credible witnesses, adults. He had found a list of 10 children who could testify that these parties were happening. The locations were there. They had found the apartment. They had found everything. And yet he was taken off the case and told there was no substance. But Driscoll himself was mostly concerned at how that officer, Gargini, knew about his intentions with Paul, as he had never told him. That officer, Gargini, had to have been told by someone else, someone connected to Lambeth Council, after Nigel Goldie expressed his concerns. So they get close to exposing parties happening on campus with rich, powerful individuals, and all of a sudden the Lambeth Council starts hiring their cronies and informing people they need to go shut this shit down before it goes public or it goes any further. Now, what's interesting is that Driscoll, the investigator, had handed over all of his investigative material on Operation Trawler to that officer, Richard Gargini, and a new inquiry took place shortly after Trawler was disbanded. Richard Gargini, that officer, was asked to head up the new inquiry called Operation Middleton. This operation was larger in scope and enlisted the help of a team of specially trained social workers known as the Child Abuse in Lambeth Team. The operation became known as the Children's Homes in Lambeth Inquiry, or Chile. In this new inquiry, Michael, the man who was holding those parties, he was no longer the only suspect. They instead looked at all of the allegations that had been made against Lambeth Children's Homes, spanning 20 years of history. But interestingly enough, all of a sudden, that investigator Driscoll, who connected all these people to the home, who had figured out that a minister of police was involved in these parties, who had gotten the names of 10 kids who had been at these parties, who had been at these parties, all of Driscoll's notes and his work went missing, and none of his leads were ever followed up on. Miss Johnson, one of Driscoll's best witnesses, never spoke to detectives again, except during a general sweep of former social workers in Lambeth. Because her testimonies were suddenly unwanted, she began to feel that the police weren't helping the children of London. They were ignoring their cries for justice. This only became more obvious when documents were presented to the police that suggested that Paul had visited Angel Road while under Michael's care during the 80s. Yet, nothing was done to follow up. So there was legit documentation that the Minister of Police had actually visited the exact orphanage at the exact time that he had allegedly visited it, at the exact time that Michael was having these parties, and they never even looked into it, even with all these witnesses and evidence. Now, in the early days of Operation Middleton, officers announced that they had 40 offenders that they intended to investigate further. However, conveniently, 16 had died. 19 of those people couldn't be identified, and only 3 convictions were secured. In its final report, Operation Middleton stated, quote, "It would be unreasonable to judge the success of the operation solely on the basis of the number of successful prosecutions," end quote. Now, Paul, the Minister of Police, in a statement, said that he only became aware of Michael when he was arrested in the late 1990s. And he went on to say that he would have been happy to help in the investigation if he had ever been approached, and that he had no recollection of ever visiting the children's home. But Operation Middleton had other failures, like ignoring Donald Hosegood's crimes, the first pedophile we talked about. Witnesses to Donald's abuses of children were ignored or never followed up on, and there was even some suggestion that the Lambeth Council had told the police that Donald Hosegood was already dead and could not be interviewed. This, however, was obviously false. Operation Middleton ended with only 6 criminal proceedings. The proceedings of Leslie Paul, William Hook, Jeffrey Clark, and 2 more offenders. But Operation Middleton's failures would not be allowed to stand, especially not by a man named Raymond Stevenson. Raymond, another victim of Shirley Oaks, was a music producer who, in 2014, had a chance meeting with a friend whom he had met while living at that care facility. When his friend confessed that he too had been raped while living at the children's home, they decided to create the Shirley Oaks Survivors Association, or SOSA, and it only took a few months for the association to have hundreds of child abuse survivors in their ranks. They all vowed to put an end to the cover-up and to reveal what had been done to them. You see, Operation Middleton and Operation Trawler had been a gross miscarriage of justice, and according to them, it was time for the truth to come out. Raymond in the past had promoted rising stars like Jessie J in his South London production office, but his studio became more akin to a police incident room as SOSA began their work. They had lost faith in the authorities after years of abuse went unadjudicated and began interviewing victims and hearing their stories.
We've spoken to over 400 children who were at Shirley Oaks. And whereas most investigations follow the victims, we wanted to follow the pedophiles, and we decided that would be the best way.
These volunteers, members of this organization, acted as social workers, counselors, and investigators. Now, Raymond and his close colleagues quickly realized that there had been a pattern of behavior. It wasn't simply 1 or 2 people who just happened to be who worked there. They saw that management was conspiring together and even allowing people from off the premises to come in to abuse the kids of Lambeth Children's Homes. SOSA identified through their work 120 different that had children inside of the Lambeth Children's Homes or on their campuses. And it wasn't long after this group formed that the members crowded into the Lambeth council chambers and relayed what had happened to them to their faces. After hearing the many stories of abuse, the Lambeth Council seemed to be apologetic. The council expressed their deepest sorrows over what had happened, and it was a good first start at reclaiming justice. One of SOSA's first demands of the council was to look into the case of Peter Davis. Peter Davis was LAA2, the boy who had spoken up about what David Hosegood had done to him and the other children in his care. And 2 years after the trial at the Old Bailey, David was found in a bathroom with a cord around his neck. And even though there were signs of sexual activity happening before or during his dying, Peter's demise was ruled by authorities as, quote, death by misadventure. Obviously, SOSA, the group, disagreed. They believed that this was murder, reprisal for speaking up about Peter's abuse, or perhaps an effort to silence him from ever speaking up again. Peter had been 15 at the time of his death in 1977. There was never an explanation, and his was considerably sudden. As the BBC looked into the death, they found court documents from the time that had been sealed for 100 years in 2003. Senior Detective Clive Driscoll believed it would be prudent to reopen the case, as did Chuka Umunna, Labour MP for Streatham, but their advice was disregarded. The police acknowledged that the investigation performed so long ago did not meet the standards of a proper investigation as they happen today. Yet, as the police received the request for a new investigation, they ruled that the matter would remain closed in the absence of further new witnesses. Now, though this was crushing news, it wasn't the end. In 2015, on November 27th, Southwest Londoner reported that an independent child sex abuse inquiry would take place across England and Wales. Their objective was to investigate the historic failings of the Lambeth Council. They included the Lambeth Children's Homes, the Anglican and Roman Catholic churches, and politicians in their inquiry. They vowed to shine a light on these criminals who had abused the most vulnerable of people. And now we get to the inquiry. This is crazy. So there had been several previous reports of the abuse of Lambeth children in the past, but none seemed to amount to much. The reports that the new inquiry would reference spanned from 1985 to 2003, a staggering 28 reports. And though reports began as early as 1985, important Metropolitan Police Service investigations would not begin until 1992. One of these was Operation Bell from 1992 to 1994. This looked into allegations of abuse at the South Vale Assessment Center. It focused on Leslie Paul, remember that guy, but implicated others as well. Operation Pregada ran from 1993 to 94, following allegations made from a victim. These came to light from a publication called the Harris Report, which identified reports made of Lambeth housing directorates creating pornographic material involving children, as well as pornographic material involving bestiality. So, there were staff members creating child porn and animal rape porn. Sound like some great people. Operation Middleton, we talked about this, ran from 1998 to 2003 and covered the allegations of abuse spanning from 74 to 94. Of the many cases involved, 16 were sent to Crown Prosecution Service, and charges, like we said, were brought against 6 of the offenders. Operation Trinity ran from 2012 to 2015 and resulted in charging Leslie Paul, Patrick Grant, June Enticott, Brenda Ball, and Philip Temple. Yet, with so few names, the public was unsatisfied. More needed to be done, and the new inquiry promised just that. This investigation was announced by British Home Secretary Theresa May on July 7, 2014. She admitted the serious failings of the system in the cases of these children who were abused, and that the inquiry would fully establish the extent of the crimes committed. While the inquiry began its work, BBC reported on what was being found. SOSA compiled a testimony of allegations they received from victims of Lambeth Children's Home abusers. The early compiled testimony named 32 Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, or IICSA, published its final report in 2022, many years after its convening. But in the meantime, they brought many facts to light through their 19 different reports. The formation of this specific inquiry began after investigations in 2012 and 2013 into the Jimmy Savile abuse scandal. This investigation alone revealed widespread abuse, including prominent political and media figures, and inadequate abuse prevention measures by child care organizations. The investigation went through 2 chairs quickly, or leaders: Baroness Butler Sloss, who served for only about a week, and then Fiona Wolf, who served only a month and a half. They were both removed due to fears that they were too close to those being investigated, which you don't want in a case like this. You want someone with no association with these people so that you can properly dig into them and that they can't be bought or intimidated. Dame Lowell Goddard was then named chair, a New Zealand High Court judge with no ties to the United Kingdom. She was a promising appointment, as she couldn't be accused of favoring the criminals in the case because she literally didn't know them. However, she too was removed with little to no explanation in 2016 and replaced by Professor Alexis J. What started out as promising quickly went downhill. The affair had a bleak outlook for SOSA, and they would go on to explain these reasons in a letter. The appointment of Alexis J caused SOSA to pull away from the IICSA investigation, as they didn't believe that she was the right person to chair the inquiry. But they had far more complaints. You see, the SOSA press statement published in 2016 started with this, quote, "Our decision to pull out of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse should have come with regret, but we are sad to say the only emotion we feel is relief. Now our members do not have to relive their worst nightmares in this stage-managed event, which has now been contrived in such a way that it enables the guilty to wash their dirty hands, whilst the establishment pats itself on the back." End quote. You see, Alexis J, that new leader, had refused to meet with SOSA since her appointment as chair, and would not listen to the victims themselves. Along with this complaint, SOSA went on to state that the inquiry was little more than a cover-up itself. They explained that nothing the inquiry would accomplish would truly illuminate the government's past of cover-ups, but effectively virtue signal without truly doing any justice. SOSA went on to implicate the Home Office or the British government in the cover-up, saying that over 6 months, they had asked questions about the Home Office liability in the case, and their answers were only ever vague or evasive. SOSA believed that the Home Office was also guilty of the initial cover-up, and the fact that they refused to open a door into their own filthy past was concerning at best. This is essentially like the Home Office linking these cover-ups to our government, to senators and the president and all of that. So this was a really big step. Yet, the inquiry moved on without the support of the victims and SOSA, making their promises to illuminate the crimes committed by Lambeth Council null. The inquiry delved into matters such as the removal of Clive Driscoll, that investigator, from Operation Trawler, but they reported on matters such as corruption, the nature of life at Lambeth's facilities, the accused and mishandling of funds. But they also looked into far more disturbing matters, the deaths that happened in Lambeth Children's Home care. Tyra Henry was 22 months old when she was killed by her father. He had previously severely injured her brother as a toddler, but Tyra had not yet been born at that time. She had been in Lambeth Council's care, yet she was allowed to go live with her father, even though he was deemed highly unfit to care for the child. Lambeth's obligation to protect this child was completely forgotten, and both individual staff and systems failed to protect her. As a result of her return to her father, her young life was lost. Mia Gabelli was killed by her mother at 7 weeks old in 1992, despite also officially being in Lambeth Council's care. Lambeth staff had known about the mother and that she had a previous record for harming her children. The mother had thrown Mia's sibling through a third-story window. And yet, Mia was allowed to stay in her mother's care completely defenseless. So the Lambeth Council wasn't held accountable for allowing these terrible parents to murder their own babies. But even more deaths were found to have occurred as a result of Lambeth's failures. In 1975, an infant died in Lambeth Children's Home under horrifying circumstances. She was found after she had already died, strapped to a top bunk bed in one of the homes. There was somehow no police investigation into this, and the brother of the infant stated that he and his family have never gotten an explanation as to what happened to his infant sister. Another child, after having been placed in Bertley Farmhouse in Surrey in the early 1990s, alleged that he had been sexually abused by staff. Some years later, he took his own life while still a child under Lambeth's care. And of course, there was Peter Davis, that young 15-year-old who had been a witness at the trial and was found in a bathroom on Shirley Oaks premises. After so many deaths were reported, it was clear that something was really wrong in Lambeth Council. After the deaths, the IICSA report delved into the rampant corruption, racism, and intimidation that had embedded itself within this organization. You see, in 1998, a woman named Helen Kenward tried to look into the records of children being kept in the homes. She was an independent consultant with 37 years of experience, and when she tried to locate files, the staff lied to her. They hid files, or they told her that the files were gone, they had misplaced them. Helen was a part of an investigation that was taking place during that time, and she was constantly faced with staff who denied knowing the people being investigated, even though she knew that they knew them. The entirety of Lambeth Council, it seemed, was corrupt. A previous report that the IICSA looked into described Lambeth staff being severely involved with fraud, with up to 500 employed staff members benefiting from illegal activities. Lambeth Council's actions from the 80s to the 90s, specifically their policies, created the perfect conditions for systemic abuse by dishonest employees and One former counselor, Miss Anna Tapsell, described everyday corruption such as children's home employees taking food from the children's home out of the mouths of the little ones that resided in these facilities. Yes, employees were stealing food from the impoverished children. The Lambeth Council also obtained leverage in the community, giving free labor to elected members through their direct labor organization. Once a council member accepted an offer of a free repair or the like, they were caught in a blackmail scheme that would threaten their public image should they try to blow any whistles. This corruption went hand in hand with the abuse of the children at Lambeth. An initial investigation into the abuse of children at Ivy House, another Lambeth children's home, was derailed by fraud. Children's home officer Mr. Thomas was instructed to investigate allegations of abuse in the late 1980s. The officer in charge of that Ivy House had been implicated in food fraud with Mr. Thomas, the home officer. And as a result, the investigation was carried out poorly to ensure that both kept their public image clean. So, you had government officials working with fraudulent members of the Lambeth Children's Homes, specifically to keep their reputations clean. If one was found to commit food fraud and child abuse, the other would be revealed as having committed food fraud as well, so they kept it hidden. It was a clear sign that blackmail was used by the council to keep their illicit acts a secret. They would implicate others in crimes by persuading them to take food or free repairs, and then threaten them if they ever got too close to the child abuse allegations. So it seemed like all these fraud charges and everything like that, these schemes were meant to protect the I want to make that very clear. Mr. Thomas, that home officer, also presented in a large case related to child abuse, Michael John Carroll. Michael, the party guy, was eventually dismissed in 1991 for fraud. He had been misusing children's home funds for his own personal gain. In a 1992 meeting document, it was discovered that the police had previously refused to investigate Michael for fraud. It was noted as consistent with Lambeth local practice involving theft against an employer. Perhaps if the police had investigated Michael sooner, he wouldn't have been allowed to continue his crimes. It is highly disconcerting that Michael wasn't fired for the child abuse allegations that were already swarming against him, but instead, he was fired for fraud. He wasn't fired for the 10 children that claimed that he was bringing men onto campus to rape them and that he was raping them. He was fired for a financial charge. After the IICSA reported on the corruption related to fraud, it also discussed people who wanted to stop the corruption but couldn't. due to intimidation. Lord Herman Ousley believed that his office at Lambeth Council was bugged at the instigation of one of his staff members. He knew of corruption in Lambeth Council and he wanted to do something about it. Yet, his home and office were broken into soon afterwards, and computer records were stolen from him as he attempted to deal with the corruption. Lord Ousley would tell the IICSA that he was getting calls in the middle of the night, that his tires had been slashed, and that his windshield had been smashed as a result of his attempt to handle Lambeth's corruption issues. So this guy made it his mission to expose the corruption. Then his office is broken into, his computer records were stolen, he's getting threatening calls in the middle of the night, his tires are slashed, his windshield is smashed. So it seems like they're trying to cover something up. One person, an extreme right-wing organization member, told Lord Ousley that his phone number had been plastered on the walls of every public convenience store throughout Lambeth. This was how so many different people had been able to get his phone number, as he was getting hundreds of calls a day at that point. Mr. Henry Gilby, Amenity Services Director, was also the subject of a serious arson attack when he tried to tackle the corruption of the Lambeth Council. His records were stolen, his office and his home were broken into, and his car was vandalized. There certainly was corruption and intimidation here, but there were still even darker things happening behind the doors of Lambeth Council offices. The Harris Report identified the racism, sexism, nepotism, and corruption of Lambeth in 1994, following allegations of abuse committed by Lambeth Council members themselves. Go figure. It described an informal network of men who used a department of favoritism to sustain organizational racism and corruption. The Harris Report also identified a person named Les, or LP, who was believed to have links to housing directorate officers associated with pornography exchange. This may have referred to Leslie Paul, the care worker for the Lambeth Council, who was also that convicted offender. And remember, previously there were these allegations that housing directorate officers were producing child at these home care facilities. To pile onto the corruption schemes and crimes against children, it was also thought that trade unions had too much of a hold on the Lambeth Council staff. That same Lord Ousley, especially believed that councillors and trade union leaders colluded together. This collusion may have resulted in an inadequate investigation into that baby Tyra Henry's death. The trade union NALGO, National and Local Government Officers Association, interfered constantly, postponing hearings into the crime and preventing inquiries from being made. The IICSA reported all of these facts, taking them all into consideration, while also not truly doing anything to resolve them. It was mostly lip service, an attempt to silence the massive group of survivors and outraged members of the public. But how? In all of these cases with so many witnesses, could there be so few people arrested? And if there had been so many criminals that Sosa had identified, where were the rest? Well, it could be that the British Home Office, the British government itself, already knew. A 2014 news story by The Guardian reports that more than 100 potentially relevant files to the 1980s Westminster ring were destroyed, lost, or are now missing. And we are going to talk about the Westminster ring soon. That is the most fucked up thing in British history. I don't want to say it's the most fucked up thing in British history, but that's what we just did the documentary on, and it's real. It's 100% real. They have tried so hard to this day to make that thing look like a hoax. No, we are about to blow the lid off of this VIP ring. But back to our story. 100 files and documents that are lost, by the way. 100. More than 100, actually. All of those files that were lost related to allegations of a child sexual abuse network, or a ring, but they all completely disappeared. The story of Shirley Oaks and the rest of the Lambeth Children's Homes were not the only ones happening at the time. As stated by the inquiry, there were implications for the church, as well as other organizations in Britain and Wales. The discovery of the files already comes after an investigation into a lost dossier given to the British Home Secretary Leon Britton by campaigning Tory MP Geoffrey Dickens. Now, Dickens passed away in 1995, but he had stated that the information that he had given the Home Secretary would blow the lid off of the lives of powerful and well-known child. Allegedly, the documents contain the names and evidence against 8 prominent, very prominent, royal, lords, MPs, government officials. 8 of those people were in that document. So, by the way, if you're wondering what the Home Secretary is, the Home Secretary in Britain is basically like the Attorney General, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, the head of the CIA, the head of the FBI, and the Secretary of State. All of those roles in the United States rolled into one. So they are an extremely powerful government official. And this guy handed over that file to Leon Britton, the Home Secretary, with documented, serious, clear information on 8 extremely prominent, high-profile figures who are members of a disturbing and child ring. Now, Leon Britton, the Home Secretary, after receiving that file, said that it would be given directly to Scotland Yard, which is basically like Britain's FBI. But Scotland Yard said they never had any record of an investigation into child abuse at the time, and that file never got to them. That's right. Leon Britton himself lost the file. Or did he lose it? I wonder what he did. I have no idea where that file went. Not like it was destroyed or anything. Then, after already claiming that important documents relating to this ring were lost, more turned up missing. 114 documents to be exact. Mark Sedwill, the Home Office's permanent secretary, made a statement to that effect. The discovery was made by an independent review of information received about organized child abuse. However, this information was never published in their report. It seemed that interfering in police investigations wasn't enough for the cover-up. They needed to destroy all proof as well. Not only could that dossier have had enough information to convict the 120 that Sosa identified, but the 114 missing documents could have put a permanent padlock on their cells alone. But perhaps the Lambeth Council wasn't acting alone. One disturbing part of the IICSA's final report, amongst its many pages, is section H.5, titled Freemasons. Apparently, there was enough evidence in this case that certain were associated with the Freemasons to cover an entire section. However, it was eventually ruled, of course, as an unsubstantiated claim. There's no evidence. The section begins with the explanation that the inquiry explored evidence of Freemasons influencing the investigation into the sexual abuse of children at Lambeth Homes. The evidence put forth is that when Donald Hosegood, that guy who the multiple children, was arrested for his crimes against those kids, he took out and waved the most unimaginable of things in the air, a Masonic handbook. It was quickly accepted that this was done to influence the arresting officers, perhaps in an effort to get himself released. Donald obviously thought that being a Freemason would curry him some sort of favor. So you just gotta imagine that, how bizarre that is. This is getting arrested, this whole thing is already incredibly corrupt, the entire thing. And when this is getting arrested, he takes out a Freemason Masonic handbook and waves it around to show the officers that he's a Freemason? Oh yeah, unsubstantiated. Just forget that I told you that. But Donald was not an isolated reference to Freemasonry. You see, Elizabeth Appleby QC created in 1995 a report that, among other things, investigated the extent of Freemasonry within Lambeth. She exchanged correspondence with the Grand Secretary of the Freemasons, and in her report, she commented the following, quote, "During the course of my inquiry, I have received numerous allegations as to the cause of Lambeth's problems, including the influence of Freemasonry, a mafia exerting pressure over the officers, and a ring holding officers and members to ransom. I have received no evidence to substantiate these allegations." End quote. However, later on in the inquiry report section, it describes that Donald Hosegood was confirmed to be a Freemason by the Grand Secretary. On the Sosa Twitter page, now called X, Sosa stated the following, quote, "Sosa were right. Freemasons running Shirley Oaks' house parent. Donald Hosegood, the person the police said was dead but was alive. Hashtag Shirley Hell." A list of names of perpetrators was given to the Grand Lodge in order to identify if these people were members. David Staples, the Grand Secretary of the Freemasons, stated that while there were no other matches, quote, "it would be difficult with absolute certainty to say that someone was not a Freemason." End quote. It was also discovered, however, that Clive Driscoll, that investigator who was pushing for justice, who had gotten the names of the 10 kids who were attending the parties, who was taken off of the case, Clive himself was also a Freemason. Clive said that while he had been a Mason for over 30 years at the time, no one at the police station had ever asked him to look the other way because of his status. Strangely, though a few names connect Lambeth to the Freemasons, their role in what happened at those children's homes remains shrouded in secrecy. But beyond the failures of Operation Trawler, Operation Middleton, the redress scheme, the missing files, and refusing to reopen the investigation of Peter Davis's death, more failures have continued to happen in this investigation. On July 28, 2017, the BBC reported a story named "Hundreds of Sensitive Council Documents Found in London Estate." These documents were found on the Gowden Estate in Clapham. and contained names, addresses, and confidential information pertaining to child protection and rent arrears. Sosa, upon hearing of this discovery, believed the files could contain missing information related to the historic sex abuse investigations that were covered up by the police and government entities. However, before Sosa could get to the files, Lambeth Council moved them to a secure location for review. Clive Driscoll agreed with Sosa that these documents could prove the fact that the Lambeth Council knew the full extent of the child abuse allegations and that they could prove that they covered up industrial-scale abuse within those children's homes. However, these documents were kept guarded by the Lambeth Council, and to this day, they have never been revealed. To this day, nobody knows what happened to those files. Nobody knows what's on those files. And to me, why the fuck are they hiding the files if there's nothing to hide? You get what I'm saying? And now we get to the mysterious death of Bulick Forsyth. Perhaps the most damning element and aspect of this entire story, though, and this is the part that intrigued me about this story. It was a report about this death that really set me off when I read about it on a BBC article that showed me there's more than the official story. Bulick Forsyth was a manager in the housing department of Lambeth Council. He managed around 10 social services around the Lambeth borough. It was Thursday, February 25th, 1993, when at 9 a.m. a neighbor of Bulick's noticed that Mr. Forsyth's alarm had not gone off as normal, and his shades were open. Strange for that early in the morning. Clearly, he hadn't gone to work or gotten up. Only 30 minutes later, a colleague of Bulick's called his home and noticed that he didn't pick up. Bulick was never late for work. He was considered to be a model employee, and so his not coming to work with no explanation was incredibly strange, to say the least. Around the same time that Bulick's concerned colleague called his home phone, a longtime resident of Foster Court noted 3 men leaving the building in business attire. They were carrying folders and briefcases, and the resident noted that the men looked official. Then, at 1:55 p.m., that same resident noted a strange car parked in the parking lot, with 2 men inside that he had never seen. But they were not the same men that left the building 4 hours earlier. At 5 p.m., a co-worker of Bulick's dropped by his apartment to check on him. The curtains were now closed, and she called through the letter slot in the door to see if he was home. No one answered. At 1 a.m. on Friday the 26th, another resident of Foster Court was woken up from their sleep by people running from the back of the building. Only an hour later, his upstairs neighbor came down to find smoke billowing in the building, and they called the fire brigade. As the fire brigade responded, it was found that a gas stovetop had been left on but failed to explode. It was discovered that missing from Bulick Forsyth's apartment were documents, but the nature of those documents has never been revealed. Also missing was his silver Rolex. Bulick himself had been found severely beaten, especially in the areas around his head. He had been dead since at least 5 p.m. when his coworker had dropped by to check on him and yelled through the letter slot. There were many theories on why Bulick may have been murdered. You see, Bulick was theorized to be bisexual, and though he had a new wife and daughter, he still would have been a target for homophobic killings. Another theory was the culture of racism in the Department of Housing where he worked. He may have been killed as a part of some sort of racially motivated attack. Another theory, though, that cultivated all three is that Bulick was disliked for more than these. Bulick did things by the book. He was honest and confronted people about things that they were doing that were against the rules. One coworker, called Person A, allegedly disliked Bulick very deeply. The culture of the housing department was toxic, to say the least, with black workers being marginalized and prevented from advancement, women reporting sexual harassment, and reports of male staff members showing hardcore pornography to others openly in the office. After Bulick was moved to social services away from housing, Person A felt they could, quote, still get to him in social services, end quote, and told Bulick something to that effect. Bulick told a friend of his, yet it was never followed up on. But Bulick's integrity was about to get him into more trouble. It is suggested that in the early 1990s, Bulick discovered that the basement of Lambeth Town Hall was being used to make pornographic films. These films, according to a confidant of Bulick's, involved children. This discovery would eventually lead to the Harris Report. So, the discovery and the allegations are that they were making child porn in the basement of the Lambeth Town Hall. Take that in for a second. All of this corruption, the Lambeth City Council being so involved with children and cover-ups, and high-profile people and officials. Now you've got them making child porn in their official building that they're probably selling? Bulick told one person in particular after this discovery that the Youth Assessment Center was closed, but was still being used horrifyingly to make child porn. That's right, the Youth Assessment Center was another property managed by the Lambeth City Council, and inside of that abandoned building, according to him, officials were bringing children there to rape them on camera. A witness in social services stated that Bulick told her he would come forward about everything he had learned. He knew of a sex abuse ring, a ring, that was running on Lambeth City Council premises, and he just couldn't stay quiet. And then, 3 days later, he suddenly turns up beaten to death inside of his apartment. After his beating, it seemed that his attackers wanted to ensure that whatever he knew died with him, because his apartment was set ablaze. His family believes, ever since his death, that he was murdered to keep him silent about what he knew. When the IICSA created their reports looking into this murder, they papered over the incident with this statement, quote, "The murder of Mr. Forsyth remains unsolved. It was the subject of a recent review by the Metropolitan Police Service, Operation Red Snow, as a result of concerns that there was a connection between Mr. Forsyth's employment at Lambeth Council and his murder. But no evidence of such a connection was found. At the very least, the murder of Mr. Forsyth is likely to have caused concern and fear on the part of staff and counselors." End quote. What a f***ing joke. Perhaps Bulick's murder was more than just a message to keep him quiet, but a warning sign for others who may stumble upon damning information that if they ever want to speak out about the Lambeth Council and their child porn ring, you should stay quiet too, unless you want to die. When the Wadsworth Guardian reported on the story, they reached out to the Metropolitan Police Service, which conducted the investigation into Forsyth's death, dubbed Operation Red Snow. Wadsworth Guardian had to speak to them because no records were publicly available. But concerningly, the police never responded to their inquiry. They got no information about the investigation out of them. There are a few witness statements, though, that seem particularly concerning and point to this being more than just a senseless murder. Bulick was brutally killed, and his Rolex was discovered missing. Some believe this to be a robbery gone wrong. But then, why would the three men have been seen leaving the area with briefcases and folders of documents? The same resident later noted that at almost 2 p.m., near the time Bulick was killed, a white car was parked in the corner of the building, and the two men inside were staring at him. This guy had lived there for a very long time at that point, almost 20 years, and he had never seen a car parked in that location before, nor had he ever seen the men in the vehicle. What's more is that person A was Bulick's former superior while at the Department of Housing, and they stated that Bulick had used a Lambeth Council-employed moving company to get into his apartment. That means that the Lambeth Council moving company had a set of his keys, which could have easily been used to make copies. Because remember, there was no struggle to get into the apartment. There were no broken windows, no broken doors. Allegedly, there was a close relationship between this moving company and the city council. These removal men had nearly unlimited access to the council offices, and it suggested that these same removal men cleared out the evidence of the child film creation in the basement of the town hall. But his murder to this day remains unsolved and uninvestigated. Oh yeah, and according to the government, it has nothing to do with that child ring that he happened to allegedly stumble upon in the basement of a city council building. After all was said and done, the inquiry had found that Lambeth Council had been grossly negligent. The current state of Lambeth Council agrees, and the strategic director of Children's Services gave a full apology to the victims at the inquiry's public hearing. The IICSA's closing remarks are that the abuse was widespread and horrific, spanning 4 decades of crime. Though approximately 705 victims were reported, like we said before, the true number of victims was likely much higher. The inquiry heard from numerous witnesses who described the nature of their abuse. It included indecent assaults and disgusting sexual abuse by numerous individuals, as well as rampant racism, violent sexual assaults, violent physical abuses, beatings, punchings, slappings, broken bones, children that were allowed to go home and were murdered, so much more. The victims also expressed what hardships they had to endure throughout their lives because of their experiences. Many of the victims stated that they had reported their abuses to adults, but they were ignored or investigations launched went nowhere. The IICSA recommended that Lambeth Council should create a comprehensive action plan to respond to issues that would arise after the conclusion of the IICSA. They advised further training for counselors, improved vetting processes, mandates for reporting sexual abuse, and finally, that the Metropolitan Police should reopen the investigation into 15-year-old Peter Davis's death. After so much pain and horror endured by these children, There were little to no recommendations for putting anyone behind bars. The report was little more than a virtue signal, a slap on the wrist for the council. It seemed once again that the victims of Lambeth Children's Homes were ignored. Section J3 of the inquiry report recorded the mass amount of reports and the date ranges they were received by the Metropolitan Police. From 1963 to 88, they received 18 reports. From 89 to 99, they received 63. From 2000 to 2010, they received 109, and from 2011 to 2020, they received 93. The section goes on to paint a bleak portrait with the following information. Quote, 529 individuals made allegations against a total of 177 adults employed at or connected with Shirley Oaks. 140 individuals made allegations in respect of South Vale, and 36 individuals made allegations arising from Angel Road against 9 adults and further unknown persons. It states that the children who made complaints were stereotyped and ignored, that those who ran away from the children's homes and reported they were abused were forced to return to them, that the police were unsympathetic to their cries of abuse, and that the children reported abusers that were in the police department itself, but they were ignored. So many children had been betrayed, and none received true justice. Raymond Stevenson, above all others, had been denied the justice deserved. Raymond had been a hero in this process, bringing people together and pushing for the law to make things right. Raymond used his exceptional talents as a music producer to highlight the suffering of the victims with a music video called "Don't Touch It, It's Mine." The music video spoke about the emotions and experiences of the victims of Lambeth's and what horrors they had to endure because of their past. But Raymond, although he was a victim, was treated unkindly by the council, unsurprisingly. He was even banned from attending Lambeth Town Hall meetings in 2018 for accusations of scuffles with security and racially abusive comments. Raymond himself denied these allegations, yet he was still banned from the premises. There was one small victory for the victims, yet it may have done more harm than good. The Lambeth Redress Scheme was opened in January 2018. Vowing to provide monetary compensation for the victims of abuse at Lambeth Children's Homes. The redress scheme paid out at least over £49 million in 2020, which equates to roughly $58.5 million US. The redress scheme was designed to allow victims to receive compensation without a lengthy court process, thereby lowering the suffering of having to relive the memories. But the redress scheme was yet another nightmare for the victims. The council initially offered insultingly low payments, $10,000 for lifelong suffering at the hands of their government. And sadly, in 2020, Mirror UK reported that the victims suffered further through the redress process, with some being driven to suicide. This was the case for Husna Banu, who we started off this episode talking about, who, because of the redress process, attempted suicide.
I had to go through those procedures and start talking about those deep, dark things that only spoken in childhood. Now I'm an adult, and it broke me. It literally broke my every single being, and that resulted in a suicide attempt. I ended up in a coma for quite a while in the intensive care unit.
She lived through the attempt, but others did not. Jason McKenzie, 41, committed suicide while waiting for his repayment process to end. The average waiting time was 18 months, a year and a half of having to relive the memories of horrific abuse. And his was not the only suicide. Others accused the redress scheme of racism, as the all-black children's home of Brixton was not included in the project. For many of the victims, opening back up about the abuses they suffered and then waiting for 18 months for the process to end was too much. The darkness of their childhood was brought flooding back, and it was too painful for them to bear. One victim, Judy Jessup, stated the scheme only made things worse. In looking at the redress scheme application document, it's clear why. The victims are required to provide details of their assault and the severity, then are told what their abuses are worth in compensation. So basically, getting your touched by a isn't worth as much as getting by a or being forced to give oral to a isn't as bad as being full-on raped by a. It's disgusting. It should all be the exact same, and it should all be a large amount of money. Because after all, these kids were forced to relive their memories, even if not in court, and then they were told how much they had earned from the destruction of their lives. The process advertised itself as swift and compassionate, while offering insulting amounts, forcing the victims to relive their abuse and wait a year and a half for the process to end. The redress scheme, as with every other detail of the Lambeth child abuse scandal, was unjust, cruel, and demented, costing further lives and inflicting even more harm upon these tortured souls who had already gone through so much. Such a story, sadly, is not isolated. More rings are reported around the world, more are discovered every year, and some are even more extensive. Child abuse is one of the cruelest actions that a human being can undertake, as their victims are helpless and innocent, unable to understand what is happening to them or get the proper help. The victims of Lambeth Children's Homes suffered to an immense scale that their lives will forever be altered. And no amount of money that redress scheme would offer would change that. No amount of money could resolve the deaths either. Several children died at the hands of Lambeth and were denied a proper investigation. Then, Lambeth claimed more lives later on during the redress scheme process. The victims wanted justice, not money. James Kenny, one of the victims of Michael Carroll, told BBC that he wanted to hear that it wasn't his fault, that he didn't deserve what happened to him. The children of Lambeth deserved to see their abusers in prison. Yet in the end, so many more walked free than were put behind bars. These harrowing events occurred in what is some people's own hometown, the city of London, a place that is supposedly vibrant and beautiful. But down every street in the Lambeth borough, the past stains the streets with the blood of unanswered crimes. Oh, I just got to chill going through that. Wow, guys, holy shit, that was a super long episode. Oh, look at all my hairs on end. I just got goosebumps from reading that. That is crazy. I feel so bad for all those kids. I'm really hoping that some of the victims watch this episode. I'm going to try to reach out to them, and I hope that I did their story justice here by trying to expose this shit. There's so many unanswered questions here in this case. Michael, that hosting those parties on the property with prominent people, police officers being involved in these rings, hundreds of that were involved in children that were never held accountable or even publicly identified. Then the unsolved murder of Mr. Forsyth and how he was going to expose a child porn production ring that was being ran in the basement of the Lambeth Council offices and in an abandoned care facility. So there's just so much filth in this story that it's absolutely mind-blowing. Be sure to share this out, everybody. Let people know what you're listening to and what you're watching, because these are stories that need to be told, that people need to know about, that we need to raise awareness about, because this has happened so many times. Somewhat major is done. It will continue to happen. And like I said at the start of this podcast, I just want to say I am doing this because this is like a passion for me. And every time I read these stories, I get so angry. I just want to do my part to use my platform that I built doing something completely different that makes me happy. I want to use it to point and shine some light on this injustice, because it's really important people understand that there are criminals that got away that are walking amongst you right now. Especially if you're watching this in London. There are hundreds of that were never convicted of crimes that are probably shopping at your same convenience store, at your same supermarket, eating dinner right next to you at a restaurant. You just never know. But anyways, y'all, thank you for watching. I will see you guys on the next one. It's always a pleasure to have you here with me. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me on this journey. Thank you for sticking around this long if you're still here. We'll catch you next week. Keep that tinfoil hat on and, stay suspicious.